Welcome to Order from Ashes, the Century Foundation's International Affairs podcast. I'm Thanassis Cambanis, and today I'm joined by Naysan Rafati, a senior Iran analyst at Crisis Group, who's here to talk to me about the once again specter of war with Iran that has become all the rage in Washington, D.C., and all the fear in Iran and across the Middle East as people wonder when and if the United States is going to attack Iran again and what might happen. Naysan, thanks so much for agreeing to come on the podcast.
Happy to be with you. Thanks.
So, I'm hoping today we can draw on your expertise to do a little bit of a reality check and a regrounding of the discussion. I'm shocked really by the casualness with which a lot of Americans are entertaining the prospect of starting a new war, and the laziness of a lot of the analytical discourse about what the likely risks, dangers, and consequences of such an act might be. So I'm hoping in today's conversation you can help us with a little bit of a current affairs tutorial steeped in the practical realities of what's happening in Iran and the region, so that folks who are thinking about this and hopefully worrying about it and trying to prevent it can get a little bit of information and useful data to think about this more clearly. So I guess to start, because again, the conversation in the United States often proceeds as if the United States exists in a vacuum and the rest of the world does not. I'd like to start this conversation from the vantage point of Tehran, and give us a little bit of a grounding of what is happening inside Iran right now, post protests, essentially pre-strikes, and how Iranian decision makers are assessing the likelihood of an attack and what they're likely to do in response.
Sure. Well, you mentioned the protests. I think we can pull back the prism a little bit, and you also use the word going to war again, right? Because we did have in the summer of last year, in June of last year, an Israeli strike against Iran in which the U.S. joined in a limited but significant fashion with Operation Midnight Hammer. You can even pull the prism back a little bit further to the post-October 7th, 2023 wars in general, because those, I think, are a thread of very significant difficulties for the Iranian system, because they have seen, especially I think since the autumn of 2024, a lot of the pillars on which they had based their national security strategy crumble, or at least become much, much weaker. So the axis of resistance, Iran's ability to project power and influence in the Levant, was severely set back with the degradation of Hezbollah in the autumn of 2024, the killing of Hassan Nasrallah, then the fall of Bashar Assad. And that kind of environment was the backdrop to the Trump administration coming back into office in January of 2025. And on the one hand, saying we are going back to this maximum pressure policy that we had in our first term, but we're also going to engage in negotiations with the Iranians. And there
Well,
were.
and let me ask you, because the distant discourse often focuses on the prospect of nuclear weapons and nuclear breakout, but in the region around Iran, where I've spent most of my adult life, the sense of Iranian power is much more conventional. It's the way Iran projects power through its alliances with states, with non-state actors, with militant groups, and also through commercial and other forms of influence. So there has been, over the last quarter century, an impression in the region that Iran is both a spoiler and a destabilizer, but also a very strong state and system. And I think that view has been called into question since October 7th, where I think there's a sort of fair interrogation of which of Iran's supposed strengths were overestimated, and maybe which of Iran's current supposed weaknesses are being exaggerated.
I think certainly on the ground, you have, the proximate and immediate concerns, right? Which, if you're in the Gulf, if you're in Israel, is Iran's alliance network, and it's Iran's ability to strike you with missiles as well, right? And over the past few years, we've seen attacks off the coast of the UAE, attacks against Saudi energy facilities. Last year, the Iranians retaliated for Midnight Hammer by striking Qatar. They retaliated for hitting for the assassination of Qasem Soleimani by targeting a U.S. base in Iraq. So a lot of countries in the region have an experience of being directly caught in a crossfire between Iran and the U.S. or being on the receiving end of actions by Iran-backed groups. And I think that actually picks up, the context of early last year, where the Israelis, I think, sensed threat and opportunity, right? Because the nuclear concern, and one of the reasons that we talk about it so much, one of the reasons why even when there was a nuclear deal in 2015, it was a nuclear deal, is not that all of these other issues are not concerns. It's that if there was a nuclear element to Iran's power projection and influence, it would be such a step, it would be such a game changer in terms of Iran's power projection, the impact on the international non-proliferation regime, and the potential consequences for an arms race in the region, that ring fencing that issue was deemed reasonable, for the nuclear deal and discussions before and after it. For the Israelis, by mid 2025, there was an opportunity in the sense that, they had seen Iran's air defense is very vulnerable in previous exchanges. They saw that, Hezbollah was no longer the deterrent force that it might have been a while earlier. And that Iran was still, despite these negotiations, which were kind of going around in circles to a certain extent, was building up its stockpiles of enriched uranium at near weapons grade. There isn't much evidence to suggest that a breakout was imminent, but the technical and material ability was getting closer than it might have been. And so they conducted the strikes in June. The U.S. joined in. And for a few months, everyone kind of went back to their respective corners. The Israelis and the Americans said that, we've done a number on the Iranian nuclear sites. The Israelis said that Iran's missile capacity has been set back significantly. The proxies are weakened. And the issue kind of went to the back burner to a certain extent until the start of this year, when these protests were happening. And protests in Iran have happened on regular bases over the past decade, but these were particularly violently repressed, spread particularly quickly at the start. And when previous administrations, including Trump in his first term, but also Obama and Biden, had generally stuck to condemnation and sanctions, Trump actually threatened to intervene. And
which many interpreted as a move that emboldened the protesters, right? To believe that they had some kind of international support, or maybe even an imminent military intervention against the regime on behalf of the protesters.
And I mean, if you look, Trump's first statements were the 2nd of January, and then he says, take over your institutions, help is on the way, these kind of things. And then the protests continue, they started on the 28th of December. They kind of continue to grow through the second week of January. And that's when the state really brings down this iron fist, and we still don't have a full sense of the destruction and death that resulted in that, but certainly several thousand, potentially in 5 figures. President Trump has given a figure of 30-odd thousand, 32,000.
And I've heard 7,000 reliably as a minimum estimate of protesters killed by the regime. Is that a fair estimate, you think?
So that number is what one of the human rights organizations has confirmed, but I believe they still have around 11,000 cases being investigated. So that
really
would
be a minimum 7, maybe reasonably 18, and maybe maximum 30,000 civilians killed by the regime in these protests.
In a very short period of time as well. And from the state's perspective, it quotation marks worked, in the sense that they were largely subdued, but at very great cost. And the other issue is that the Iranian government, in every one of these protests, I mean, we've seen We saw protests in 2017, in the winter of 18-19, obviously in the Women Life Freedom protests in 2022. Every time the system's playbook has been kind of the same thing, which is start by saying, oh, we acknowledge that there are some grievances we have to discuss, then crack down very hard, and then do nothing to address the actual grievances or just make them worse. So this is not a sustainable, position. But in terms of the moment that you're asking about that we're in right now, the administration started with, this mooting of a humanitarian imperative, and there's a lot of reporting that by mid-January, the U.S. was close to conducting some sort of strike. But two things kind of pumped the brakes on that. One is that the U.S. did not have, I think, enough defensive assets in place, because concern that Iran would retaliate meant that we needed what we have seen over the next month, which is the U.S. deploying a lot of both offensive and defensive assets into the Middle East. And the second thing was that a lot of regional countries were, contacting the White House and saying, let's not start a war just yet. Let's take a pause, because this is going to impact all of us. And again, part of the defensive assets that have come into place are not just to defend U.S. Interests, but also U.S. allies across the region. And then over the past few weeks, we had that backdrop of the U.S. threatening to intervene, and then also a return to negotiations. And so talks between the White House and the Iranians had been largely on ice since the war. There had been 5 rounds of negotiations in April and May of last year. There was supposed to be one just before the war started. That obviously fell apart. And like I said before, both sides went to their respective corners, and there wasn't really much by way of diplomatic engagement. And so where we are right now is that the US and Iran, tomorrow, as we're recording, Thursday, the 26th, the US and Iran are scheduled to hold a third round of negotiations between Special Envoy Witkoff and Jared Kushner on the one side, and Iran's foreign minister on the other. And President Trump has said that, they need to make a deal, and if they don't make a deal, bad things happen.
So we have this regime in Iran that is profoundly unsympathetic from many perspectives. Repressive regime. It killed, as we just said, a great number of peaceful protesters, and of course it has been at various times at loggerheads with the United States itself directly, with Israel, and with a number of U.S. allies in the region. On the other hand, or not on the other hand, just also a part of the picture is that this is a serious state, and this is a real state with real institutions and real military capabilities and real deep social support within Iran, right? This is not, this is a regime that, no matter how strongly some dislike it, commands some substantial constituencies within Iran that support it. So this is not a regime that is wholly and wholesale rejected by the entire population of Iran, and it's a regime that's proven able to inflict real damage in military confrontations. And lastly, I'll note from what you just said, if the Iranian government is willing to kill maybe multiple tens of thousands of its own citizens in a short period of time, in a few weeks, it must consider what it's facing to be an existential threat for its own survival as a regime, right? It wouldn't take such violent and drastic action unless it felt its key survival interests were threatened. So with all that, and feel free to correct or amplify any of that as you see fit. But to the extent that describes the state of play, how is Iran likely to proceed in order to defend itself as a regime, and what kind of support can it command? What kind of harm can it cause?
Great question. So in terms of, its social support, it's impossible to quantify this. I mean, we can look at the metrics that we have available, like election participation and things like that. That's been dropping significantly over the past, couple of nationwide elections. We've had this pattern of nationwide protests on an increasingly frequent basis. The economy is in a very bad state, right? The real sets new record lows every day. Inflation is running well over 40%. So it's a system that is not delivering. Now, there will be a cadre of supporters. I think you're right. I wouldn't deign to quantify it, but it's not huge. But it also at the same time clearly has both a capacity and a willingness to deploy the capacity of coercion at home, right? So it does still have a security force that is largely loyal to it, is willing to kill and injure thousands of people to retain its grip on power. Militarily, we've seen over the past year or two, especially in Operation Rising Lion and Midnight Hammer, we've seen its vulnerabilities, right? Its air defenses are largely ineffectual. Its intelligence services are deeply penetrated. I mean, the fact that the Israelis, within the first act of the war, were able to take out senior Revolutionary Guard brass and senior nuclear commanders shows that there is a deep intelligence failure within the system that no one really has been held accountable for. No one really got fired over the fact that they were caught off guard and had scores of senior experts and commanders taken out in minutes. And their missile capacity in three exchanges that they've had with Israel. There were two in 2024, and then during the 12-day war, they are able to send a lot of missiles. The Israeli interceptions and the Allied defenses that are layered during those wars meant that they did not cause a huge amount of damage. They were able to maintain them for a period of time. They were able to send Israelis to shelters for the better part of 2 weeks. But I think the Israelis reported 86% interception, and 1 out of 1,000 drones actually made any difference from the Iranian side. That all being said, it still has a lot of assets to your question. And in the event of a US strike, one of the things that they've already done is, that kind of when two cars are driving at each other in a game of chicken, the Iranians have already thrown the steering wheel out the window. And Khamenei, a week or two ago said that, any strike on Iran will prompt a regional retaliation. So in terms of capacities there, they still do have a fairly formidable ballistic missile arsenal. They have rebuilt some of those capacities since June. They are able to target US bases in the region, US allies in the region. They are able to threaten shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. We've already had kind of one quasi incident during this buildup where a US F-35 shot down an Iranian drone. Some Iranian boats tried to then approach a US tanker. Reinforcements were sent in. The tanker continued on its way. But between them, and so those are the conventional capabilities they have. It would also be a question of whether and under what circumstances what's left of the axis of resistance could get involved. So in the event of hostilities with the Houthis, once again, who've largely, held to this ceasefire with the Americans, would they start to harass shipping or fire at US forces? Is what's left of Hezbollah capable of mounting any attacks against Israel? So the Iranians have capacity to cause harm. That's why you've seen the US deploy one of the largest buildups since 2003. We have 2 aircraft carrier groups that are either there or en route, scores of aircraft and defensive assets.
Yeah, and in the next segment of this conversation, we're going to focus more explicitly on the debate over whether to go to war, or the discussion. I mean, there's not much of a debate, but anyway, over the American decision making over whether to initiate a war of choice. And in my view, just because you can get away with a war of choice doesn't mean you should. In fact, I think you should not. But we're still in the opening chapter here of our conversation, where we're talking about a sort of descriptive assessment of Iran's capabilities and Iran's role in the region. And I want to dive down a little deeper into this question of capability and risk, because I think it does lie at the heart. I mean, it's created a moral hazard, or a heightened risk of an elective war against Iran. Uh, it certainly seems, since October 7th, that Iran and the wider axis of resistance did not possess powers and deterrent capability that many governments and analysts thought they did. Right. So there was a view that Iran itself, through its missile program and then through its proxies and alliances, could cause real significant harm. Right. Could target American bases and kill Americans. Could target Israeli military targets and cause significant damage. That it could target Israeli civilian infrastructure and cause significant damage. And absolutely, this view, which I'm a little bit skeptical of as a genuinely useful military option, but this view that certainly in the Gulf, that Iran, if pushed into a corner, could substantially cripple oil infrastructure in the Gulf, and maybe terrify civilians, or make the neighboring Gulf countries feel unable to function under the threat of Iranian fire. Now, that last one seems to me like a fake capability, because I don't see a scenario in which Iran would target civilian targets in the Gulf, because I think that would provoke such a response, that it would be, but I don't know how you rate those different capabilities, and how Iran itself might rate either accurately or inaccurately its own capabilities.
Look, I think that there is, so the Axis capacities. I mean, one of the issues is that the Axis as a whole, after October 7th, mobilized enough to put them in the Israelis' crosshairs, but not enough to make a substantial difference to the balance of power in the conflict. And so Hezbollah fired, some of the Iraqi paramilitaries fired, the Houthis fired, but some of the chatter, like among the debates in Tehran, was why didn't we just all go in after October 7th, like immediately? And then maybe that would have made a difference, because what actually happened is that they did enough to, the Israelis were able to repel most of it. And then, once the brunt of the Gaza campaign was over, the Israelis just turned their attention north to Hezbollah. And then Assad was falling in the meantime, and then the Israelis could just turn to the Iranians last summer, right? And so their combined power, to the extent, now you can say that maybe they mobilized all they could, and that their capacities we had overestimated. I mean, the notion that Hezbollah had 150,000 rockets and missiles doesn't seem to have really borne out. So is it that they just had less than we thought they did, or did they not use it in the way that we anticipated that they might in the event
Or
of
were
it?
they so deeply penetrated that they did have it, and when they decided they wanted to use it, they couldn't, because the Israelis had their own agents on their own access to the switches or the coordinates.
No, that's true. I mean, look, we all know the big events that have happened, but from late 2023, the Israelis kind of upped the game in terms of taking out individual IRGC commanders based in the Levant, based in Lebanon and Syria. And these were some of the people who were the Iranian experts in terms of funneling material and getting funds through and things like that. So it was an attritional process before it even got to the pager attacks and the walkie-talkie operations and everything else. Now, bringing it back to where we are right now, I think there is among some in the Iranian system, especially some among the like the IRGC hardliners, who say that if there is a US attack, we have to try to go all out as soon as possible. And the reason for this is that in previous exchanges with the Americans, we've responded in a limited manner that led to an off-ramp against a bigger conflict. And that basically has shattered our deterrence, along with everything else, that the air defenses don't work very well and the ballistic missiles have not been quite as advertised. But what happened after the Americans killed Soleimani in 2020? We attacked Ain al-Assad base, and no Americans were killed. I mean, 100 plus were injured. I mean, it was
Traumatic brain injury, right? Pretty
pretty
major.
significant. It could have been very, very bad. But there were no U.S. fatalities. President Trump was able to say that the attack is over, and the two sides kind of moved off the precipice. Again, after the U.S. attacked in Midnight Hammer, the Iranians basically telegraphed a retaliation against Al Udeid base in Qatar. And the US said, okay, that's their retaliation, and we're done, and we're all going to move towards a ceasefire soon. And within a couple of days, there was a US, Iran, Israel ceasefire ending the 12-day war. On top of which, and I know we might come back to the US perspective on this, is that Trump's personal preference for a lot of his operations have been mitigated risk, high impact. Soleimani, Maduro, Midnight Hammer, none of them led to significant costs for the US, and
At least not short-term, immediately visible ones.
at least not short-term, immediately visible ones. And the one campaign that did seem to drag out a little bit inconclusively, which was the Houthi campaign, the US kind of pulled the plug on after a couple of months. And so some people within the Iranian system will make the argument right now that it was our, self-deterrence against, against the Americans that has put us in this position where they now think that they can keep striking us every couple of months, or the Israelis can keep striking us every couple of months, that the only way out of this is a kind of sharp escalation. And that presents Trump with a challenge he hasn't really faced in this term, where Maduro was snatched and there was agreements with his vice president, and that was like I said before, high impact mitigated risk type of operation. Midnight Hammer was the same thing. The Israelis had already demonstrated that Iran's air defenses were largely going to be ineffectual. The US had practiced runs against Fordo for the better part of 2 decades, and the Americans very quickly said, that's our operation. Our Midnight Hammer is striking Natanz, Fordo, Isfahan. We're done with that. The Iranians responded by striking Al Udeid. They said, we're done with that. And so there was an off-ramp in all of these instances. Whereas here, what the Iranians are signaling up front is, again, how much of a capacity they have to actually follow through with this to be determined. But what they are saying is, we will regionalize this, and there is no such thing as a limited attack this time. There is no such thing as a calibrated response this time. You've been talking about regime change. You're talking about striking nuclear or ballistic missile facilities or whatever the target package is ultimately going to end up being. And so the Iranian overt posture is that if you're going to do that, bring it on and we will retaliate. Again, how much they can actually follow through to be determined.
You're listening to Order from Ashes. I'm Thanassis, Cambanis, Director of Sentry International, and I have the pleasure of speaking today with Naysan Rafati, Senior Analyst for Iran at Crisis Group. He's helping me better understand, hopefully you as well, listeners, what is at stake in the unfolding U.S. confrontation with Iran and maybe lead up to another war. So we've been talking in quite a lot of detail about, the capabilities of Iran, the view from Iran, And I want to move us over the next couple of minutes from there to the decision making in the U.S. But let's take a couple of more passes over some aspects of this. So one thing that I think is really important for figuring out what's likely to happen next is this question of how much of a paper tiger is Iran really? I mean that I'm sympathetic to what you were describing before the break about the way Iran interprets uh, sort of it's now at a do or die point where if it doesn't really cause damage, it has no deterrent capability. But my sense is that Iran's greatest strength is its ability to control its own territory, right? To mainly its ability to control Iran, even without legitimacy among some significant chunks of its own population. Outside of its borders, it's been fairly effective as a spoiler, sometimes effective as let's say in a generative way, in helping its allies in, let's say, Iraq, push back ISIS. Its military capability and its governing capability to project power in a power consolidating way hasn't been tested that much, to be honest, right? It's the strongest performance of the axis of resistance hasn't been something Iran has done. It's been things that Hezbollah has done, and Hezbollah is more than just an Iranian proxy. And I don't want to get us too sidelined here, but if we look at the last couple of years, I would say starting on October 8th, when Israel gave its warnings to, or rather, when Hezbollah joined the war against Israel, there has literally not been a single moment where Iran or any of its allies have been able to effectively do anything militarily, with the exception of the Houthis, who have been able to effectively disrupt shipping. And I would argue that the Houthis are probably the least uh, clearly to be understood as a piece in the Iranian chessboard, but rather as maybe a close ally with interests of its own. And I think that's been a surprise, right? Analytically, militarily, it's been a surprise. So when I hear the Iranian statements now, I mean, I don't want the U.S. to start a war because I think that the risks and the downstream consequence, I think it's the wrong thing to do, and the risks and downstream consequences are massive and unpredictable. But I don't believe the Iranian rhetoric, because if they had these capabilities, they would have displayed more of them or used more of them in the last 2 years during these other moments of crisis.
Look, I don't think that's at all inaccurate. The Iranians have had three major exchanges over the course of the post-October 7th wars. There was April 2020, losing track of time at this point, April
24. I
24,
was in
and
the marshes of Iraq, and I actually saw that missile barrage go overhead from a boat,
yeah.
which is really something.
Yeah, that would be. Yeah, so April 2024, October 2024, and the 12-day war itself. Um, but I think one of the interesting things is, you and I can look at it and look at the balance of what happened during those wars, and you try to do, what each side achieved in every column, and the Iranians have the short stick of results, right? Air superiority, Israel; intelligence superiority, Israel; nuclear capacity, largely degraded at the very least, and maybe not obliterated entirely. But for the Iranians, and it's an open question to me how much they actually believe this, the 12-day war was for them a victory in a sense. And let me explain it. And again, I'm not endorsing this view by any means. And I think that there are probably a lot of people in Tehran who say it with one raised eyebrow. Otherwise, they wouldn't be negotiating with the Americans at this point. But in their narrative, there was a surprise offensive in which a regional superpower and eventually a global superpower um, together struck Iranian assets, had the advantage of surprise, were able to take out upper echelons of the IRGC. Despite that, in this narrative, command and control was largely maintained. Iran was able to mount its response. And key to this narrative is that at the end of 12 days, the Israelis and Americans accepted a ceasefire. So, in that telling of what happened, if Iran's position had been that weak, the US and Israel wouldn't have accepted a ceasefire. They would have gone for the jugular. And you can look at it as this kind of threshold of pain kind of analysis or definition of victory analysis, right? For the Iranians, by the end of the regime was still standing. That's it. Like that's the definition of success. So if that's your definition of success, the losses don't matter as much because the end was that you were still there, even if everything around you was rubble. And that's a different definition to success than the Israelis might have. I mean, the Israelis also came away very bullish after that war. The Americans obviously came away very bullish from the initial takeaways from Midnight Hammer. But that narrative kind of, I think, suggests that at least for some in the Iranian system, that notion of, what is victory, what is defeat, what are our achievements versus what are our losses in all of this is based on a different set of parameters. Like we look at it and say 86% of your missiles were intercepted. And they would look at it and say Israel has never been under as big a barrage for as long a period of time in decades. It put Israelis into shelters. They had to use multiple layers of defense. They needed the US to come help them shoot these things down. They've never had to experience this sort of thing. And no one's been able to achieve that. Again, it's a very minimal, cynical definition of success. But I think it also informs their position right now. I don't think they're looking forward to getting into a war. I think they are hoping that this negotiation process gives them an off-ramp from this. I think there probably are people in the system who question this narrative that I just laid out, which should be questioned about what success actually looks like. But I think that there are some people in the system who think that we can essentially win a war of attrition. The US, we're outnumbered and outgunned, but we can outlast.
Well, and right, and this is part of the real, I think, what's so dangerous about this strategic moment, right? I mean, the Iranian regime, I think, has been a toxic force in the region for a long time. It has started conflicts, deepened others. It's encouraged really bad governance norms in countries where it has deep influence. Thanks to Iran, there are weak or collapsing states in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, elsewhere. It's not a good faith player in the neighborhood. And you know, just because I don't like that doesn't mean I think it's a good idea for a superpower to try and kill everyone in the regime and change the regime. And this context, along with Israel's long maximalist determination to foment regime change all around the region, including in Iran, has created this, I think, frightening and destabilizing gap between rhetoric and practice in U.S. policymaking on this front, right? So the you know the policy as discussed doesn't sound completely crazy, right? The policy is using the threat of force in order to come to a lasting agreement on Iran's nuclear program that includes verification and some kind of genuinely enforceable mechanism for making sure Iran doesn't reach nuclear weapons breakout. Now, if that were really the policy, we could debate, the specific tactics, but that as a policy goal seems reasonable within, within the realms of international policymaking. But in fact, when we look at the aftermath of last summer strikes and the apparent plans to strike again, maybe as soon as this weekend, as you noted, we're speaking on Wednesday, February 25th, and this is the third weekend, I think, when I've recorded a podcast before the weekend, unsure whether there would be a war with Iran over the weekend. But at any rate, the actual U.S. posture seems to be one about regime change and not about this nuclear deal. And that is where that disconnect is what makes me nervous because, first of all, the U.S. hasn't passed a resolution to go to war with Iran. There's no congressional oversight. There aren't any of the processes that the U.S. Constitution mandates for making a decision to go to war. So we don't actually know on what basis the U.S. is considering doing this, what extent, to what extent it would try and initiate a regime change war under the guise of a strike that's supposedly just about the nuclear capabilities. And certainly from observing the congressional discussion to the extent that exists at all, and the hawkish lobby in Washington that really is thirsting for a regime change war. The picture that's coming into focus for me is that regime change hawks in the U.S. are sensing that they might get their wish and persuade Trump to start a regime change war against Iran under whatever pretext. They don't care. They don't care what the trigger is. They know what they want it to escalate to.
Well, I think that at this point, I mean, including in President Trump's State of the Union, the explicit goal has, I mean, Trump himself has mused about regime change, right? He said that it would be, it could be the best thing that could happen. He said that, Khamenei's got to go. At other times, the focus is more on these security issues. The nuclear and missile issues in particular came up yesterday during the State of the Union, again, as we're recording. And those are also the things that are the subject of the negotiations that have been happening. And Trump himself, for the most part, focuses on nuclear, occasionally discusses the missiles. Other people in the administration also bring up proxies, and others also bring up domestic considerations. So you do have if you're being critical of Iran, you have no shortage of things to be critical of. And I think that this, as it stands right now, is also the part that the administration from the State of the Union seems to be building up in terms of what the rationale is. So President Trump yesterday said that they may be attempting to rebuild some of their nuclear capacity, and they are trying to expand their missile program. Now, as it stands from where we sit with information available in the public domain, there is no information available that suggests Iran is currently enriching. That program seems to have been dormant since June. The IAEA hasn't been able to inspect, but where that suggestion of actively rebuilding comes from, I'm not sure. It may still be classified. It may be something else that we just haven't caught yet. Missiles, we know that they are reconstituting. The notion of a missile that could hit the U.S. is still years away.
I mean, that's fanciful, right? I mean, North Korea maybe have missiles that could hit the U.S. among rogue states, but is it practical? Is it practically plausible that Iran is developing or has developed missiles that could reach the U.S.?
Yeah. It's a matter of over which time horizon and whether, so the Iranians have missiles that can certainly go up to 2,000 kilometers. That brings parts of Eastern and Central Europe into range. They do have space launch vehicles. The technology has been kind of seen as a potential way for them to build up the range of their ballistic missiles as well. I think there was an assessment last year by the Defense Intelligence Agency saying that by 2035, the Iranians could have a couple of score of ICBMs. But I think this comes down to, the fact that the U.S., to the extent it is, building up for a potential military operation, in some instances, seems to suggest that it would be, to bloody the Iranians' nose and bring them back to the table for greater concessions. And then you move up the spectrum into, trying to change the leadership, to trying to go after the strategic assets, including nuclear and ballistic missiles, and then, further up the chain. And right now the president has talked about nuclear and missile. He's talked about humanitarian, but I don't think anyone in the administration has yet made an argument that this is a regime change war. But at the same time, they have, I think, not yet made an argument that while nuclear and missile capabilities are concerning, are they imminent and necessitate the use of force? And how would the use of force improve the situation? And over the past few days, we've seen a lot of reporting come out about not opposition by the U.S. military, but at the very minimum concern over scenarios where this becomes an attritional, drawn out conflict where the Iranians do pose a risk to U.S. interests and allies in the region. And what does success in this context look like?
Yeah, I mean, this is where we sort of get to our closing section about the dangers of this kind of talk. And I mean, you know, Iran, a state, a problematic state that the U.S. doesn't like, and maybe for good reason, in a state that has some serious missile capability. Um, why does that lead to let's go to war against that state? I mean, Pakistan harbored Osama bin Laden, and Pakistan has a nuclear weapon, and supported the Taliban for decades. The U.S. doesn't go to war with Pakistan, and maybe the lesson there is that's because Pakistan has a nuke, and therefore it's safe from this kind of negotiation by missile and fiat. But this is the part that beggars the imagination for me. 25 years after. Or close to 25 years after the invasion of Iraq, and a war that is in many ways, I would argue, still going on to this day. Um, how can we see the political class in the United States so cavalierly entertain, like, oh well, let's see what happens if we bomb a bunch of targets in Iran and try to decapitate the regime, and maybe there'll be a civil war, maybe there'll be regime change and we'll get someone we like in power, maybe we won't and it'll be chaos, but so what, it's very far away. I mean, this, to me, all this kind of talk seems completely unmoored from reality, right? It seems like in the best case scenario of such an intervention, you have tens or hundreds of thousands of people being killed and untold strategic consequences. Even if it's not missiles striking the United States or Israeli infrastructure, you're going to have the center of the world's petrochemical uh, uh, supply at war with the most powerful military state that knows how to use its military in combat, facing an existential threat, which to me seems like such a high risk that even if we rate that as a 30 or 40% risk, so like maybe the US can get away with it, but the upside danger of that seems to me very risky. And also, like, negotiating this way creates its own bad realities that are bad not only for countries in the region, but also for the United States. Like, even if you get away with the type of quote unquote negotiation that the abduction of Maduro entails, let's say, or the negotiation through occasional bombing that the discourse with Iran entails, that creates that creates an entire incentive structure that's terrible for everybody.
Look, on the negotiation approach, I mean, this is, you can ask, Venezuela, but you can also ask the EU, you can ask Greenland. He approaches negotiations by, putting every tool he has at the table and asking for very maximalist demands, and then sometimes the other side folds and sometimes they don't. And That is his unique approach or announcing tariffs or whatever it is, right? And so in this case, you can look at it and say that, this deployment, if it is indeed, towards furthering the hand at the negotiating table, is, I mean, you're not going to, put an armada outside of Denmark, but it's of a style of putting as many chips as you can on at the table and making the other side blink. And again, sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But in terms of the risks, look, it's I think the president himself, if the Iranians came back with an offer, and the other day he was saying that they haven't said the sacred words, "We don't want a nuclear weapon." Now, obviously, words aren't enough, and proliferation experts will very quickly tell you word is great, but what you actually need is verification to sites. You need accountability on fissile material. You need documentation. You need a whole lot of things to make sure that the word is actually backed up by substance. But, in that scenario, Trump can say, "I got the best nuclear deal ever." And then, but maybe there are more maximalist US demands on missiles, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that I think the Iranians, I can see the Iranians having a little bit of wiggle room on missiles, but, some of the demands that they bring down their missiles to, 300 kilometers or 500 kilometers is basically asking for disarmament. So you can argue that, elements of Iran's foreign policy are highly ideological. Even this insistence on enrichment, which they base on their rights under the NPT, you can say that, okay, you have the right, but at this point, the cost-benefit analysis just doesn't make sense for you to maintain this right to enrichment when you haven't been enriching for 8 months, et cetera, et cetera. Ballistic missiles, it's a bit more rational in the sense that if it's your only tool and your adversaries are asking you to give it up, your assumption would be that the very next day they'll bomb you and you won't have the missiles to respond. And that's their game plan. But I think you're also right that there are some people in Washington, I don't know whether President Trump at this point falls into this camp or not, for whom discussions of nuclear, discussions of ballistics, discussions of proxies are auxiliaries to the primary issue, which is that the Islamic Republic of Iran is an ideologically hostile force. It is unpopular at home. It is threatening to U.S. allies and interests in the region, and that any attempt to negotiate even the best deal on nuclear and the greatest concessions on missiles and the most spectacular climb downs on proxies doesn't really get you long-term advantages, because at its core, this regime is almost like a cartoon villain and has been for 40 odd years in terms of its death to America ideology, death to Israel ideology. And, for that to change would require something within the Iranian system to change, because that is, it's occasionally observed in breach, but that is one of the core pillars upon which the Islamic Republic has based its worldview.
And we have, I think, no recent historical examples of U.S. military intervention successfully engendering a good regime in its aftermath. My fear is that U.S. disregard for democracy and democratic norms, as well as Israel's, makes clear there's no strategic commitment to a good government in Iran that's good for Iranian people, right? This is not, the threats for war are not because Trump wants to see a representative democracy in Iran that fulfills the aspirations of Iran's people. And what we saw in Venezuela was a quick invasion and retreat, and at least there wasn't an effort to change the regime, and I mean the regime was left entirely intact, and one of its faces was removed. So my fear is that the U.S. and Israel pursue this maximalist set of interests in Iran. They do so with pretty cavalier use of force. They manage to avoid getting deeply implicated by putting boots on the ground, and notwithstanding the kind of analysis like the piece of Nate Swanson's that I just read in Foreign Affairs before we spoke today, which predicts that Iran will escalate because of the existential survival issues for the regime, that in fact it can't escalate. So in the end, what we'll have is cyclical attacks like the strikes last summer, a regime that is increasingly beleaguered, but still intact, still able to kill its own citizens, perhaps, maybe less able to govern, and maybe less able to disrupt affairs in neighboring countries, and that this kind of slow war could continue for years, and be sustainable, and from the vantage point of a Trump or a Netanyahu, success story. Does this seem possible to you? And if so, what's the harm in that set of outcomes?
As you're describing it, it sounds to me, wonder what you think about it, that it would be kind of an interwar Iraq, right? In that scenario, where it's a state that is significantly weakened, significantly eroded in terms of its public legitimacy, but is able to cling on to some degree of control and power. I think that at this point, I mean, it depends on if the war actually starts, how limited or grand it becomes, what the US is actually going to strike, what happens within the Iranian system, which is, I think, the greatest blind spot that we all have, is what level of palace intrigue there is, or might have been. 'Cause you would imagine that even after the June war, there are some people in the system. We talked earlier about these people who said, no, we should have gone bigger, harder, faster at the start. And I think that there are also likely to be foils to those people saying, we've lost the axis, we've lost the nuclear program, our economy is not doing well. What is the point of this kind of death to America stuff? And those have always been marginal voices within the system. But I think that the impact is going to be on the military, on Iranian, on Iran as a country in terms of its infrastructure and its people. But also, I think the biggest question mark is within the system. If you go for decapitation options, or targeting wide swaths of the leadership, that creates a vacuum. Who fills that vacuum? Is it people who come from that more antagonistic side of the system? Is it someone who comes from the more pragmatic side of the system? If it's anyone from within the system or system adjacent, then how do the people that have been out protesting against the system respond to that? Is it good enough that it's someone different, or is it still a vestige of the system that is not to their liking anymore? And if it's wider chaos, then the scenarios become worse, and we've seen plenty of those in the Middle East. I think you're right that there aren't that many happy endings. It doesn't necessarily have to be a sad one either, but all options are on the table, I think, right now.
Yeah, and I mean I think the one thing that's certain is that the United States won't be dictating outcomes, right? So if there is a strike or series of strikes that degrade the regime in Iran or create a vacuum, or the possibility of some kind of succession, it won't be the United States choosing who emerges as the dominant figure or figures in the subsequent period, because that's going to depend on a lot of factors that are Iran-centric factors that have to do with who has legitimacy, who has the ability to persuade security forces and others to come to their side, and so on. I do think another thing that I just want to end on is that these are machinations that affect people's life and death. These decisions aren't just about pinprick strikes against evil leaders in bunkers. These are colossal mobilizations of military force that are going to kill a lot of civilians, and disrupt life for thousands or maybe millions more, and should not be undertaken casually or lightly, or sort of on a lark. Let's see what happens. There's a reason why nations should be very deliberative about when to go to war, because so many unforeseen consequences happen, and it's extra complicated here because the Iranian regime has been so problematic for so long, right? I mean, it's not a sympathetic sovereign state. It's a sovereign state that's used its sovereignty for a lot of ill. But then again, it's not it's not America's role to decide which of the countries it doesn't like should be allowed to continue to exist in their current form. Um, Naysan, thank you so much for coming on Order from Ashes. I'm Thanassis Cambanis, director of the Century International. I've been speaking with Naysan Rafati from Crisis Group, a senior Iran analyst there, and hopefully we don't get to come back on in a few weeks to analyze a new war, and instead we can look at unfolding events that don't include a new massive regional conflagration. Naysan, good to talk to you today.
Thanks for having me.